what is the role of the antithesis in public theology? So Kuyper talked a lot about the antithesis, talked about the way in which, basically worldviews clash when it comes to particularly public issues. You're going to have a distinctly Christian worldview clash against a non-Christian worldview, and even within Christianity, you're going to have, certain clashes with regard to Catholicism and Reformed theology, just as two examples that you mentioned already. What is the role for Kuyper of the antithesis when it comes to engaging in public, what we would now anachronistically call public theology?
So I think for Kuyper, you really have to hold common grace and the antithesis together. There are traditions which are inspired by Kuyper, or figures who are inspired by Kuyper, who are much more apt to emphasize the common grace part and not talk about the antithesis so much. And then there are traditions that you could say are much more heavy on the antithesis and not so much on the common grace. For Kuyper himself, those two things definitely have to go together and be held in balance and intention. So from the common grace kind of perspective, you can talk about all the commonality, all of the good gifts that continue to exist after the fall, in one way, it's a kind of explanatory doctrine about why things aren't as bad as they could or should be, given what we believe about the comprehensiveness of the fall. Why is there still good out there? Why might we be able to observe something like civil good even among people who don't profess Christ or are not regenerate? It serves that kind of explanatory function, but not just that. It also is a platform for other kinds of engagement and other kinds of developments. But the antithesis, as you rightly note, is a kind of a limitation on that. So it gives us some basis for some realistic norms about how far and how extensive this common grace, or activism, you could say, Christian action on the basis of common grace might extend. So it's an explanation, it's an attempt to explain, as you noted, all of the different worldviews that are out there, which have just multiplied since Kuyper's own day, even though I think he identified many of the kind of key dynamics of modern secular and pagan worldviews. Just what the limits of cooperation or the limits of appropriation or engagement might be, because there is a fundamental soteriological distinction between those that are part of the body of Christ and those that are not. So on the one hand, you've got an attempt to really do justice to the insights that can be gleaned, the truth that is out there, in the sense of all truth being God's truth and having its source and origin in Him, wherever it comes from, being normed and conditioned and limited by this really radical understanding of the way of life and the way of death, you could say, going back all the way to the Didache. But there's these two fundamental ways of being in the world. One is fallen and one is redeemed. And there is overlap. We remain human beings as redeemed human beings. So there's commonality there, but there's a difference in terms of, obviously, things as fundamental as our understanding of God. The understanding of the human person, obviously, is really important. One just quick illustration of this, Kuyper talks about the antithesis within the context of human learning, right? So this is where it may come up a lot, especially in kind of academic settings where you're trying to engage between theology and other modern disciplines like anthropology or sociology or economics. What are the shared points of departure, or the shared assumptions, and where do things differ? And Kuyper had a kind of a rule of thumb that the more you engaged a topic that had as its object, the object of discussion, spiritual realities, the greater divergence there was going to be. So there is a difference, obviously, in many ways between a Christian doing astronomy and a non-Christian doing astronomy in terms of how you interpret the wonder that they experience and these sorts of things. A Christian doesn't necessarily adjust a microscope or a telescope differently than a non-Christian scientist, but certainly within our frames of interpretation. And yet, we measure things the same way. A Christian kilogram is the same as a non-Christian kilogram in that sense. But as we're dealing with human realities and increasingly spiritual realities, there's going to be a corresponding greater divergence between our understanding of how all these things relate. So a materialist is, from a Christian perspective, going to have a hard time understanding something like sin. Not just a hard time, it's going to be impossible. It's going to be a category that doesn't make any sense, right? Whereas from a Christian perspective, and a much more comprehensive and holistic view of the human person as body and soul and spirit, you can have what certainly somebody like Kuyper and I would say as a theologian is a much more robust understanding and interpretation and way of understanding the human person and all of those dynamics. So that's one example of how the antithesis kind of comes to concrete expression in Kuyper's thought, is this principle of increasing differentiation as you deal with more spiritual realities.